Hi, I'm Ahmed Shabuddin. Welcome to the stream. Today we look into two places still reeling from catastrophic disasters linked to climate change. Recovery efforts in Pakistan are continuing after the worst flooding in decades displaced more than 33 million people and submerged one-third of the country. And in Puerto Rico, hundreds of thousands of people remain without power 10 days after Hurricane Fiona made landfall. We start in Pakistan, though, where challenges continue to mount and civilians are paying the heaviest price. Here's Abdullah Fadil from UNICEF with more.
The resilience of the people, the generosity of the people of Pakistan to respond to their own citizens, and the role of the government to really scale up is impressive. The gravity of these situations before the floods was already such that the worst indicators of malnutrition, access to health, access to education was already in the worst of the country. The diseases that now we're facing are diarrhea, malaria, cholera, and skin diseases that are actually quite invasive. About 2.5 million people have no access to drinking water. 400,000 children are now facing severe acute malnutrition. We anticipate about 6 million children are out of school as a result of the floods. All of this now requires attention.
Nearly 1,600 people have died so far, and concerns about water-borne diseases, as you just heard, food security, and the country's ongoing financial crisis is rising. With us to discuss this, Neha Mankani, founder of Mama Baby Fund, which provides rapid emergency response to women and their families. She joins us from Karachi, Pakistan. And Basav Sen, the Climate Justice Project Director at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. And of course, remember, you could always join us on YouTube with your thoughts and questions. Now, I want to start with the recovery efforts. The scale of this crisis, this disaster, what can you tell us is most needed at this given moment?
So there's a lot of things right now. I wouldn't even say that we're at recovery yet. I think we're just still waiting for the water to recede before people can actually start even thinking about going home. Right now, as mentioned, health issues are really at their, maybe not even at their peak, they're getting to their peak. So there's a lot of need for health interventions, there's a lot of need for medication, there's a lot of need for food interventions as well. People have lost a lot of, as was mentioned, people have lost a lot of their crops. And whatever limited resources they have, that's gone down significantly more. So there's a need for shelter, there's a need for food, there's a need for health interventions. And there's just a need for kind of a vision on how we're going to move forward with recovery when we're actually able to do it.
Of course, and you outlined so many needs, and I know that they're competing needs, and I'm wondering, when we know that roads, bridges have, completely been washed away, as well as railway lines, that entire villages, were submerged, so much farmland destroyed. You think about the agriculture, the sector, economically, it's, 23% of the GDP of Pakistan. With that in mind, where do we focus? Is there going to be a lasting recovery that's actually feasible? Is the government able to handle this in your mind?
Right now, I would say that we don't even know how it's going to be done. And I think, we've lost more than 2 million acres of crops. The entire cotton crop, not the entire cotton crop, but like more than 75% of our cotton crop has been completely destroyed. The next planting that will happen is wheat, which will be around in 2-3 months. And by the time wheat season comes around, I don't think that the land will be ready for it. So I'm not really sure what we can even expect in terms of recovery. But I know that for recovery to happen, there will be a need for a lot of inputs, not just from the government, but from external players as well.
We've heard, Basav, that the government's doing its best. We saw the government praised there by the UN. I'm wondering, though, when you look at the sort of macro big picture, it's been months since the record flooding began. At least 81 of the country's 160 districts have been categorized as calamity hit. When we think of rebuilding, what's on the forefront of your mind? Is it feasible, and is it possible to really hone in efforts in one sector, or is the whole situation just too unmanageable?
I would not call any situation, however drastic it is, unmanageable if, number one, there is the collective social and political will to do it, and number two, there are the resources to do it. And in the case of Pakistan, and in the case of actually many countries across the global south, that second question, the resources question, is intimately tied to our present global political and economic order. And when I say present, I mean honestly for the last several hundred years, because in many fundamental ways, the political economy of colonialism and the legacies of colonialism have changed.
Right.
I mean, why is it that Pakistan is a global south country to begin with? Why do we even have a category called the global south? It's because of the history of imperialism, right? It's because of the theft of resources by the British Empire and lots of other, empires, French, Dutch, etc.
Right. And, I appreciate you bringing up that point because it's very relevant to the conversation we're going to be having about Puerto Rico in just a little bit. Very similar in that sense. But, when speaking of the government says it could take 10 years to repair and rebuild the infrastructure. They also outlined that the losses are already over $10 billion, with, of course, an economy that's already been struggling for so many reasons, the pandemic, inflation. I actually want to have a listen to what the leader himself had to say about all of this. Take a listen. Prime Minister Sharif.
Early estimates suggest that more than 13,000 kilometers of metal roads have been damaged, over 370 bridges have been swept away, 1 million homes have been destroyed, and another million damaged. More than 1 million farm animals have been killed. 4 million acres of crops have been washed away, stripping the people of their breadbasket, and damage of an unimaginable scale.
Neha, what do you make of those comments, those numbers? I mean, we know that both Pakistan and the United Nations have blamed climate change for the extreme weather and resulting devastation. So in your mind, who's responsible and how can Pakistan rebuild?
So I would say that, yes, it's absolutely climate change. This is not something normal. These super floods are not something that we would ever have even expected to see in our lifetimes. So it's definitely climate change that's made this happen. But I would say that it's not just Pakistan. I mean, we all know Pakistan's contribution to the carbon emissions is less than 1%, but they are one of the 10 most affected countries in the world. And I think we should really start having more conversations about the global north, about how the global north can work with us to for climate reparation, and kind of, we should see who's paying the price and where it comes from and what can be done for us.
And, these questions, of course, on the minds of so many people. And I want to actually take a quick moment to share with you what someone had to say on this issue of Pakistan's role versus richer nations and their role in tackling these issues and the road to recovery. So take a listen to what Rachel Cletus had to say.
A recent scientific study shows that climate change increased the likelihood of this man-made disaster. In some of the worst affected provinces, the 5-day maximum rainfall intensity was increased by as much as 75% because of climate change. In a warming climate, the warmer air can hold more water, and that water comes down in the form of these extreme rainfall events. In Pakistan, an additional risk factor is melting glaciers, also caused by warming temperatures. The sad fact is Pakistan is responsible for less than 1% of the emissions that are fueling climate change, and yet is bearing the cruel brunt of its effects. It's time for richer nations to pay up for the climate loss and damage that low-income, climate-vulnerable countries like Pakistan are experiencing.
Basav, what are your thoughts on what Rachel just outlined there and what we heard from Neha?
She is absolutely right. And what's more, the degree of responsibility of the global north goes even beyond what we heard in the clip from Rachel. It's not just that the global north countries emit a lot more in both aggregate terms and per capita terms, but also their cumulative emissions since the start of the Industrial Revolution are way more than from countries in the global south. And the reason cumulative emissions matter is because carbon dioxide, when it goes up into the atmosphere, is a very stable gas. It can last for hundreds of years. So literally right now, molecules of CO2 are sitting up there in our atmosphere, cooking our planet, that were emitted maybe 100 years ago.
Right.
Mainly from the global north, which was, the industrialized part of the world at that point of time. And what's worse, if you look at the history of the Industrial Revolution, how did it even happen? How did northern countries even have the capital for the Industrial Revolution? It's again because of colonialism, because of the appropriation of capital from their colonies.
Well, I appreciate you again bringing up colonialism and that sort of exploitative history. It's not often enough, I think, that we have those conversations when there's not an emergency. But today, certainly an important conversation. I want to thank you, Neha, for being with us. Now, speaking of colonialism, imperialism, on to Puerto Rico. On to Puerto Rico, where it's been 10 days since Hurricane Fiona made landfall, wiping out power and water across the entire island. This disaster came on the anniversary of Hurricane Maria, which killed 3,000 people, and it took 11 long months for the U.S. to restore power to the island. Puerto Ricans are scrambling to figure out how or whether to rebuild, as the compounding nature of these climate disasters really makes recovery that much more difficult. Here's Alex Guzman outlining what Puerto Ricans need most right now.
Puerto Rico is the victim of an abusive relationship with the United States. From the U.S.-imposed privatization of the state-owned electric company, which has resulted in blackouts and rate hikes over the past year and has completely broken the electric system in this crisis, down to the Jones Act, which Puerto Ricans feel the effects of every day, but is particularly dangerous in times of emergency. Puerto Ricans need more autonomy to respond to the needs of the island, especially in times of crisis.
Joining us from Boquerón, Puerto Rico, Damari Burgos is a member of the Solidarity Brigade of the West, working to provide local relief. We also have joining us in the conversation Basav Sen, who's been with us since the top of the show. I want to start by coming directly to you. Damari, it's I was there for Hurricane Maria. I endured something that I couldn't have imagined, and to see the same thing happening again, to see all the sort of systemic issues that are preventing the recovery. What do you want to share with us? What's the most pressing thing on your mind right now?
Well, first I want to say thank you to Jazeera for this space and for denouncing the abusive relationship that Mr. Guzman just pointed out in the earlier clip, and my greetings to your other guests today. There's a lot of frustration here. There's a lot of hopelessness here. There's a lot of rage here, and I think a lot of people are still stunned precisely because we suffered this so close to the anniversary, the 5th anniversary of Hurricane Maria. Mm-hmm. And I have to correct you,
please,
if that's okay.
Of course.
There was, and this is no fault of yours, because that's part of our problem, is that there's such lack of statistical and accurate information. Various universities came together to estimate our total death count, and it's said to be over 4,645, And I have to hold true to that number because it's very symbolic. It's become an open wound for Puerto Ricans here.
I appreciate you making that correction. I remember covering this on the ground. I remember a lot of confusion over numbers, not just of the dead, but many different parts of the story seem to have been suppressed back then, which is why we're talking about it today. I want to ask you, in terms of the status of sort of recovery efforts right now, beyond the hopelessness, about 33% of homes and businesses, if I understand it correctly, are still without power. And what we've seen that kind of is troubling to me is a lot of conversations about profiteering, the privatization of sort of the energy grid. I mean, the story, for as much as it's about loss of life, it's really about the power crisis, right? Why is the power crisis seemingly insurmountable? And what can be done?
Well, I think that in order for people to understand the complexity of the situation that we are struggling with here in Puerto Rico, you have to understand the larger picture. And I so appreciate this talk about the global north and the responsibility of the global north, because part of the reason, a large part of the reason why we were so vulnerable before Hurricane Maria, and definitely the reason why we were so vulnerable to a Category 1 hurricane with Hurricane Fiona, was precisely related to the austerity measures that we have been imposed on by the United States government just a year before the passing of Hurricane Maria. And one would think that might not have to do with the vulnerability, the extreme vulnerability that we have, but it has everything to do with it. When the Promesa Fiscal Board came was imposed by the Congress of the United States as a way to solve or get us out of our debt, we were limited surpluses, and they were questioned that we had surplus in materials of our electrical company. Why do you need extra materials? Well, because we're an island, and in times of crisis, it's hard. It's very difficult to get materials here. Mm-hmm. And as your visitor was mentioning, the Jones Act makes it almost impossible for shipments to come regularly. Sure. Another one of the austerity measures that made us particularly vulnerable was the closing of 900 schools. Mm-hmm. And you would think, well, that's understandable because your birth rates have gone down and there's so little people on the island at this point. Mm-hmm. But the reality is that schools in Puerto Rico turn into shelters when we are in hurricane season, mm-hmm. which of course is part of our life in the Caribbean. It's a normal occurrence. So not having 900 schools to put people in order to keep them safe also makes them vulnerable. And finally, the closing of and the privatization of our health system also has made us extremely vulnerable.
Right, so many compounding issues. And Basaf, I see you want to jump in. I'll let you jump in just a moment. I want to bring in to the conversation a voice from our YouTube chat. Here we have Rio Sanchez saying, I think big corporations have to pay up and cut their emissions. People are too greedy for their money and don't care that they're bringing everybody down with them. And just so you know, in YouTube, a lot of general reactions to sort of seeing the images of the destruction. Traumatic, not just for those maybe on the ground, but those who understand why this continues to happen. So I do want to ask you, with that in mind, we heard the mention of the brain drain that worsened after Hurricane Maria and Irma. I think the island saw a 12% drop in its population between just 2010 and 2020. Where do you put the blame, but not just the blame, with the Jones Act, with all these privatization and profiteering realities on the ground time and time again, every time a disaster strikes? What will it take to actually protect Puerto Rico and the people living there, the U.S. citizens?
Is this a question for me?
Basaf, no, sorry, I'm asking, forgive me, I'm asking you, Basaf.
Yes, so first of all, before addressing precisely that, I want to go back to something you brought up about the reactions in, the reactions on the YouTube channel. The fact that people were very deeply disturbed by the images from both Pakistan and Puerto Rico. Now, my response to that is, yes, those are very hard images to look at. Stay with them. Because that's the kind of human empathy we collectively as human beings need to cultivate in a time of global climate catastrophe. If we don't have that empathy for human beings going through horrific things in different parts of the world,
right,
and we don't begin to value our common humanity, then we can never respond to the climate crisis with the kind of just response that we need. And in terms of what Puerto Rico needs right now, I would defer to Damari to provide the details, but one kind of overarching observation I would make, which connects Puerto Rico in a straight line to Pakistan, is this imposition of austerity from the outside, whether it's by PROMESA, the control board in Puerto Rico, or by the International Monetary Fund in Pakistan, whose debt to GDP ratio is of the order of 69%. And this external debt and the way in which international institutions prioritize paying back debt over the interests of human beings is something we need to get rid of.
Right, and in the spirit of time, I do want to ask you and defer to our other guest who's on the ground, who's lived this experience time and time again. I want to ask you, for our audience who doesn't really understand the Jones Act, it's, a ship carrying fuel to Puerto Rico can't dock, essentially, due to some 1920 U.S. law that mandates that the ship be built, be owned, and be staffed or run by U.S. citizens. That ship has 300,000 barrels of diesel still holding off the southern coast of Puerto Rico. We see this each time. We see the compounding, if you will, the compounding situation. Do you have faith that that will change? Do you have faith that the dynamic, the relationship between the U.S. and Puerto Rico will evolve to a point where Puerto Ricans, can kind of, withstand these storms?
Well, I have to say, and I'm sorry to point that out again, but our problem isn't with the hurricanes. It's not about the storm. The storm is a natural occurrence, even though the climate crisis is a real issue and is making it extremely difficult to prepare enough for them. Our problem is not a natural disaster. It's a man-made disaster. It's a political disaster. It's a colonial disaster.
And forgive me for interrupting you, but I do want to ask you, because in the spirit of time, just again, before you wrap up, I mean, a lot of the people, if I'm not mistaken, who've remained since Hurricane Maria have been pushed out of their homes, as we've heard, by land developers. There's a huge cryptocurrency investor scene there. They've bought out apartment buildings. Rent is soaring. You add to that the pandemic has, I think 40% of the population under the poverty line. Where do you want to start?
60%.
60%. What's your sort of last call out to the world? What do you want the world to know?
I think that when you hit rock bottom, there's only up, and that's where we are. I think that our patience is running out, and I see it in old people. I see it in young people, and I think that we're running out of time to do this in an orderly way. I have hope because there's nothing else that we can really count on. That we will transition towards independence, and that we will gain reparations from the global north.
Well, just so you know, this is not a conversation that ends here at the stream. Thank you to both of you for being with us, and for those of you watching, as hurricane season continues, we'll be following the impacts of climate change around the world. Thanks for joining us.